War reshaped societies in countless ways, but few transformations are as intimate, far-reaching, and emotionally charged as those that occur within the household. While battles rage on front lines and strategies unfold in war rooms, another kind of struggle takes place in kitchens, markets, and dining spaces, quiet, unseen, and yet essential to national survival. Women, often positioned at the center of domestic life, become the anchors of stability during wartime, transforming food scarcity into endurance, chaos into structure, and fear into courage. Rationing, designed to manage limited national resources during conflict, becomes more than a governmental policy. It becomes a daily test of ingenuity, sacrifice, emotional strength, and leadership. This introduction explores the profound role of women in feeding families during war, setting the stage for understanding how rationing reshaped gender roles, domestic culture, and community life in ways that extended far beyond wartime conditions. Rationing was, in essence, a system of forced equality that confronted every household with the same numerical limitations, but how those limits translated into everyday meals depended overwhelmingly on women. They were the ones who walked long distances to stand in queues, negotiated with shopkeepers, tracked ration coupons, resolved shortages, substituted missing ingredients, and made impossible decisions about how to divide scarce resources among family members. In doing so, they became the managers of a complex survival economy, a demanding, emotionally loaded form of work that history often fails to fully recognize. The war may have mobilized armies, but it was women who mobilized kitchens, turning humble ingredients into sustenance and transforming scarcity into stability. Before the war, cooking, meal planning, and grocery shopping were tasks often taken for granted or undervalued in public discourse. But when conflict erupted and rationing systems took hold, these same tasks suddenly carried national importance. Government posters urged women to do their bit by reducing waste, stretching ingredients, and following nutritional guidelines. Pamphlets, radio programs, and community workshops were devoted to new cooking techniques designed to maximize vitamins, calories, and flavor while using only the minimal rations allowed. Women were asked not just to feed their families, but to sustain national morale, support the war effort, and maintain the health of generations whose futures depended on them. The kitchen became a battlefield of its own, one fought not with weapons, but with pots, patience, and perseverance. Central to the challenge of rationing was the emotional and psychological pressure it placed on women. They were expected to remain calm under scarcity, resilient under exhaustion, and endlessly creative despite limited resources. They carried the guilt of empty shelves, the worry of malnourished children, and the responsibility of supporting elderly members of the household who struggled with dietary changes. Yet their emotional burdens were often invisible. Diaries from the era reveal quiet confessions of fear, stress, and fatigue, even as these women publicly maintained the outward composure demanded of them. They prepared meals that soothed anxieties, symbolized normalcy, and reminded families that warmth and care still existed despite the upheaval outside. But women did not endure this burden alone. Rationing during wartime gave rise to new forms of community solidarity as women shared recipes, swapped ingredients, and supported one another through moments of discouragement. Community kitchens and canteens became spaces of collaboration where women learned from each other and built networks of mutual support. These networks not only eased the practical burdens of rationing, but also provided emotional relief and solidarity. The relationships built through these shared efforts became some of the most enduring legacies of wartime domestic life. Rationing also forced women to rediscover or reinvent traditional skills, gardening, preserving, fermenting, and baking that had faded in many urban areas before the war. Victory gardens became vital sources of nutrition, and women led these efforts with remarkable enthusiasm and discipline. The act of planting seeds, tending crops, and harvesting produce offered families not only food, but also hope, a tangible, life-affirming reminder that growth continued even in the harshest circumstances. These gardens became symbols of self-reliance, ingenuity, and perseverance, roles women embraced with determination. In feeding families during the war, women also played a crucial role in caring for the most vulnerable members of society: children, the elderly, and laborers whose bodies bore the strain of long hours in factories and fields. For children, wartime meals shaped both physical growth and emotional security. For the elderly, meals provided comfort and stability in a time of uncertainty. For workers, food was fuel that kept wartime industries running. Women became the bridge between vulnerability and survival, adjusting recipes, adjusting expectations, and adjusting their own needs in order to meet the demands of those that depended on them. Beyond the practical and emotional challenges, rationing altered the cultural meaning of food. Meals that once symbolized abundance, celebration, and tradition were stripped down to essentials. Birthdays were marked with makeshift cakes, holidays with simplified dishes, and daily meals with ingredients that often looked unfamiliar or uninspiring. Women learned to reinvent traditions, substituting ingredients while preserving the emotional significance of rituals. The ability to create joy from scarcity became a unique form of cultural preservation, proof that even under extreme pressure, families could still share moments of connection. When the war finally ended, the legacy of women's wartime labor did not disappear. Rationing persisted in many nations long after victory was declared, and women continued to rely on the ingenuity and adaptability they had developed during the conflict. Even after rationing systems were lifted, the habits formed during the war, respect for food, careful budgeting, creative substituting, and resourcefulness, continued to shape domestic practices. Many women carried lifelong anxieties about waste and scarcity, while others retained pride in their ability to sustain families under impossible conditions. The war had revealed their strength, and that strength redefined how women viewed themselves and how society viewed them, contributing to broader movements toward gender equality in the decades that followed. Perhaps the greatest legacy of rationing is the recognition that survival during wartime depends not only on soldiers, generals, and political leaders, but equally on the invisible, uncelebrated labor of women who feed families, maintain routines, and protect the emotional well-being of those around them. Their kitchens were not merely domestic spaces, they were strategic centers of resilience, where the war was fought in quieter but no less significant ways. This introduction sets the foundation for understanding these women not as passive figures in wartime history, but as essential agents of endurance, creativity, and hope. Rationing was a national policy, but women were its implementers, interpreters, and innovators. They balanced shortages with strength, fear with courage, and exhaustion with unwavering devotion to their families. Their contributions ensured not only physical survival, but also emotional continuity during one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. As the chapters ahead explore in depth, the story of wartime rationing is ultimately a story of women, of their ingenuity, their sacrifice, their emotional labor, and their quiet heroism. They turned scarcity into sustenance, uncertainty into stability, and domestic life into an enduring symbol of resilience. Their legacy endures not only in historical memory, but in the cultural practices, values, and stories passed down through generations. When war erupts, its shockwaves seldom stop at the battlefield. They travel quietly, relentlessly, into the smallest corners of domestic life, reshaping the everyday routines that once seemed so stable and familiar. For women on the home front, the kitchen became the front line, a place where global conflict collided with ordinary survival. The transformation was neither instantaneous nor uniform, but it was universal in its emotional weight. What had once been a space of comfort, nourishment, and familial connection became an arena of constant negotiation, sacrifice, and ingenuity. As supplies tightened and the demands of total war intensified, women found themselves confronting a new reality. Feeding a family had become a strategic act, one that required adaptation, patience, and an unprecedented level of resourcefulness. The shift was profound enough that the very rhythm of daily life changed, affecting everything from morning routines to evening rituals, and shaping the psychological landscape of millions of households. Before rationing systems were formally introduced, there was already an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of the kitchen. Newspapers warned of shortages, governments urged citizens to conserve, and rumors spread quickly through neighborhoods. Women, who traditionally managed household food supplies, felt the pressure first. As market shelves grew unpredictable, they began to sense that the world outside was intruding forcefully into their private domestic sphere. Shopping trips were no longer casual errands, but tactical missions. The familiar abundance of ingredients that had once filled pantries gave way to uncertainty. Women began stocking up when possible, stretching ingredients creatively, and learning to prepare unfamiliar cuts of meat or less preferred staples. Even before official rationing, they were adjusting, instinctively preparing for scarcity. This pre-rationing phase was marked by anxiety, improvisation, and a subtle but unmistakable shift in how families viewed food. Every meal began to feel precious. Every saved ingredient became a potential safeguard against an unpredictable future. When rationing finally became institutionalized, everything changed with greater speed. Governments distributed ration books, urging citizens to remain calm, while also introducing propaganda campaigns that praised thrift, discipline, and sacrifice. Posters displayed smiling women holding pots and pans, accompanied by slogans encouraging resourcefulness. Food became a patriotic tool, and the act of cooking was framed as a form of national service. Women were told that their careful planning helped soldiers at the front. The implication was clear. Wasting food was not merely irresponsible, it was unpatriotic. This messaging deeply affected how women perceived their roles in wartime society. Their domestic labor, often overlooked in times of peace, was suddenly framed as essential to national victory. But with this newfound recognition came extraordinary pressure. Feeding a family was now a matter of moral duty, social expectation, and emotional resilience. The spirit of sacrifice entered the kitchen, and the responsibility often rested on women's shoulders alone. Ration books dictated weekly allowances of staples like sugar, butter, meat, and tea. Women spent hours calculating, planning, and adjusting menus. What had once been a creative but predictable activity, deciding what to cook, became a complex logistical challenge. For many, the shift was overwhelming at first. Imagine standing in a queue early in the morning, holding a ration book in hand, hoping the shop would still have the week's allotment. Imagine searching for alternatives when ingredients ran out, then returning home to face a hungry family expecting a meal. This new reality forced women to rethink every assumption they had about food and cooking. They learned to substitute, to stretch, to combine, to preserve, and to innovate. They discovered new recipes through government pamphlets and community exchanges. Cooking classes filled up as women sought to master the art of doing more with less. Kitchens evolved into experimental laboratories where the goal was not indulgence, but endurance. The emotional transformation of the kitchen paralleled its physical and practical changes. Women often found themselves carrying the emotional weight of fear, uncertainty, and the responsibility of sustaining morale at home. Children, elderly relatives, and sometimes even recovering soldiers depended on them for nourishment and comfort. Even the act of setting a dinner table became symbolic. A well-prepared, resourceful meal could reassure a family that stability still existed despite the chaos outside. But maintaining this facade required enormous strength. Diaries from the era reveal that many women struggled with stress, guilt, and exhaustion. They feared disappointing their families, failing to meet patriotic expectations, or appearing inadequate in comparison to neighbors who seemed to manage better. The emotional burden of feeding a family under wartime constraints was seldom acknowledged publicly. Yet behind closed doors, countless women wrestled with the fear that one miscalculation, one burned dish, one poorly planned meal might lead to hunger or hardship. In addition to emotional strain, practical challenges multiplied. Electricity outages, fuel shortages, and long queues at markets disrupted routines. Many households shifted cooking schedules to accommodate blackouts or reduced fuel rations. A pot that once simmered for hours now had to be carefully monitored to conserve heat and fuel. Some women cooked multiple meals at once to avoid reheating. Others relied on community kitchens when resources ran especially low. The ingenuity displayed in these moments was extraordinary. Women created makeshift tools, repurposed kitchen equipment, and learned to preserve food in ways they never had before. They dried vegetables, canned fruit, pickled eggs, fermented cabbage, and stored root vegetables in ways that maximized longevity. Community cookbooks circulated, filled with handwritten tips, substitute ingredients, and creative solutions. These shared resources became lifelines, weaving together a fabric of communal resilience. The psychological transformation of household roles also played a significant part in reshaping the kitchen's identity during wartime. With many men enlisted, women became the de facto heads of households. Even in families where men remained at home, the burden of managing food often fell solely on women. Cooking, which had once been seen as a domestic chore, became a full-time strategic responsibility. Women monitored every grain of sugar, every ounce of butter, every scrap of leftover food. They balanced nutrition concerns with scarcity and rationing policies. They learned new nutritional guidelines issued by the government, ensuring that family members, especially children, received essential vitamins and proteins. Feeding a family during wartime was not simply about providing meals, it was about safeguarding health, morale, and psychological stability. Every kitchen became a place of negotiation between old habits and new realities. Favorite dishes had to be reimagined with substitutions. Tea might be diluted. Cakes might be baked with carrots instead of sugar. Stews replaced roasts. Families learned to appreciate whatever the household cook could produce, though not always gracefully. There were moments of frustration, especially among children who struggled to understand why beloved treats were no longer available. Women often bore the brunt of these frustrations silently. Their commitment to maintaining family unity and emotional well-being demanded patience and compassion, even when their own emotional reserves were depleted. Many women journaling during this period describe moments of quiet despair, nights spent worrying about dwindling supplies, mornings spent strategizing meals for the week, and afternoons navigating long queues, sometimes only to return home empty-handed. The cultural significance of the kitchen deepened as well. In peacetime, the kitchen had often been a symbol of domestic comfort, warmth, and tradition. During wartime, it became a symbol of endurance, resilience, and sacrifice. Women often decorated their kitchens with small touches, flowers, colorful cloths, or handwritten recipes to maintain a sense of normalcy. These gestures were acts of defiance against the chaos of war, expressions of determination to preserve dignity and hope. The kitchen became a microcosm of the broader wartime experience, a place where the harsh realities of scarcity collided with the emotional necessity of nurturing and caring for others. As the war dragged on, the home front became increasingly intertwined with national policy and propaganda. Governments encouraged women to grow victory gardens, turning backyards, rooftops, and shared plots into food-producing spaces. Many women embraced this opportunity, not just because it supplemented their rationed supplies, but because it offered a sense of empowerment. Growing their own vegetables placed at least a small portion of food security back into their own hands. Children were often enlisted to help with weeding, watering, and harvesting, turning gardening into a family activity that reinforced resilience and cooperation. In many communities, women exchanged seeds, gardening tips, and surplus produce, strengthening social ties. The wartime garden was not just an agricultural solution, it was a symbol of hope, self-reliance, and community solidarity. Within the kitchen itself, cooking became more scientific. Government pamphlets taught women about calories, vitamins, and food groups in straightforward language, empowering them with knowledge previously confined to professional nutritionists. Women learned to calculate meal values, plan for balanced diets, and ensure that family members received essential nutrients despite limitations. Ration books were more than small paper booklets. They were symbols of a new wartime reality, instruments that reshaped daily life in profound and lasting ways. When governments introduced rationing systems, the intention was to ensure fairness, stability, and the equitable distribution of scarce resources. But for the women on the home front who were responsible for feeding their families, ration books represented both a lifeline and a daily challenge. Their pages were filled with stamps, coupons, and coded symbols that dictated what families were allowed to buy. Each tear of a coupon marked a step deeper into a world defined by scarcity, discipline, and strategic planning. The rationing system was intended to maintain social cohesion and prevent panic, but it also demanded a level of organization and adaptability that transformed household routines. Women became experts in deciphering the rules, tracking inventory, and planning meals in sync with government decrees. Their lives shifted into a rhythm guided by the dates, numbers, and limitations printed inside these modest booklets. The introduction of ration books was rarely smooth. Lines formed outside distribution centers as families waited to register. Identification papers had to be checked, addresses verified, and household members recorded. Women often brought children along hoping to complete the process quickly, only to find themselves waiting for hours. The issuance of ration books made the war feel real in a way that air raid drills or newspaper headlines had not. Holding the booklet, thin, stamped, official, felt like holding a piece of the state's authority in one hand and the weight of responsibility in the other. For many women, the moment they received their ration book was the moment domestic life transformed irrevocably. No longer could they simply make a shopping list and buy what they needed. The process of feeding a family now required strategy, patience, and an understanding of evolving government regulations. Children received ration books too, and many families treated these documents with great care. Mothers stored them in drawers, envelopes, or tin boxes, safeguarding them like treasured possessions. Losing a ration book could lead to chaos, requiring tedious hours of paperwork, verification, and appeals to local authorities. Some women lived in constant fear of misplacing them. They taught their children not to touch the books, warning them that these little paper booklets were as important as keys to the house. In some households, the ration books were placed beside religious items or family documents, emphasizing their importance. This reverence reflected not only the fear of bureaucratic consequences, but also the understanding that without these books, feeding a family was nearly impossible. Once ration books were distributed, the learning curve began. Women found themselves confronting unfamiliar rules that governed what they could buy, how much, and when. Some coupons were valid only for certain weeks. Others were restricted to specific food categories. The color-coded system could be confusing at first, and women often turned to each other for help. Discussions in queues, markets, and community centers became essential sources of information. Women shared tips on maximizing coupons, avoiding mistakes, and navigating shortages. In many neighborhoods, elders or more experienced women became informal advisors, helping others interpret the rationing system. These interactions strengthened social bonds, fostering a sense of collective resilience in the face of shared hardship. The weekly shopping routine changed dramatically under the ration book system. Instead of a single, straightforward trip, shopping became a cycle of queuing, negotiating, and adjusting plans. Women woke up early to secure their place in line, knowing that supplies were limited and might run out before their turn. They carried their ration books carefully, along with coins and small notebooks where they kept track of what had been used and what remained. Shopkeepers, too, had a new role. They became enforcers of government regulations, examining ration coupons closely, recording transactions, and sometimes refusing requests if coupons were missing or mismatched. This dynamic occasionally created tension, but more often it fostered a sense of shared responsibility. Shopkeepers understood the pressures women faced, and many offered advice on substitutions or alerted customers about upcoming deliveries. The rationing system did not only restrict staple foods like sugar, butter, meat, and tea. It also limited access to clothing, fuel, soap, and other essential goods. As a result, ration books became tools not just for food management, but for managing overall household survival. Women learned to stretch not only ingredients, but also soap bars, clothing fabric, and fuel rations. They patched clothes, darned socks, shared tips on laundry efficiency, and bartered for necessary items when allowed. Despite the strict rules, some communities developed informal systems of exchange. Women traded coupons they did not need for items they valued more, though this was often done quietly to avoid government scrutiny. These exchanges were acts of survival, born from necessity rather than defiance. The bureaucratic complexity of the ration system added to the burden. Government pamphlets, newspaper announcements, and radio broadcasts informed citizens of updates, changes in rules, or reductions in allowances. But not all households received the information at the same time, and misunderstandings were common. Women had to stay alert, listening to broadcasts carefully and asking questions in markets. Some kept scrapbooks of government notices, clipping newspaper articles that explained the newest adjustments. This vigilance added emotional strain. Any mistake, missing a valid coupon period, misunderstanding the rules, or miscalculating weekly allowances could result in real hardship. The pressure to remain informed and organized turned women into domestic administrators, responsible not only for cooking but for navigating an ever-changing bureaucratic landscape. The ration book system also exposed inequalities between households. Families with more members typically received more total coupons, though not necessarily enough to meet their needs. Single mothers, elderly women, or widows often struggled the most. They had fewer hands to help with queuing, fewer adults to register for coupons, and less energy to manage the complexities. Children were sometimes put in the position of helping, whether by accompanying their mothers to the markets or carrying ration books. In some households, older children became adept at understanding the system themselves, taking on the responsibility of queuing or searching for scarce items. These intergenerational efforts reflected the deeper fabric of wartime resilience, a mixture of duty, cooperation, and necessity. For many women, ration books became symbols of both control and constraint. On one hand, they represented fairness, a system that aimed to prevent hoarding and profiteering. On the other, they restricted autonomy. Women who had once taken pride in preparing abundant meals now found themselves limited by what the state allowed. This shift created emotional turmoil. Some women felt empowered by their ability to manage the system effectively. Others felt frustrated or even ashamed when they struggled to meet the expectations of maintaining a well-fed household. The ration book was a constant reminder of wartime limitations, and its presence at every shopping trip reinforced the sense of living under watchful national scrutiny. The emotional weight of the ration books grew heavier as supplies intensified. There were weeks when ration coupons were valid, but supplies were unavailable. Women queued for hours, only to return home empty-handed, their carefully planned meals dissolving along with their sense of control. These experiences built emotional resilience, but also caused exhaustion. Some broke down in tears at the market. Others developed strategies to protect themselves emotionally by forming groups to queue together, sharing information to reduce uncertainty, or teaching themselves not to expect too much. Communities learned to support each other not just logistically, but emotionally. The rationing system may have been designed by governments, but its emotional and social management fell largely on the shoulders of women. Over time, ration books became ingrained in daily routines. Women created systems to organize coupons, envelopes labeled by category, strings tied around grouped coupons, or notebooks that tracked weekly usage. This deep sense of organization was essential for survival. Some women developed remarkably detailed household strategies, planning meals weeks in advance, tracking expiration dates of coupons, and forecasting shortages. These skills were rarely acknowledged publicly, but they were essential to maintaining household stability. The quiet labor of managing ration books was a form of domestic intelligence, sharp, adaptive, and essential. Despite the challenges, the ration book system created opportunities for learning and cooperation. Cooking classes often included lessons on maximizing ration coupons. Community groups published newsletters with updates and tips. Teachers incorporated ration education into school lessons, helping children understand the importance of conservation. These efforts turned rationing into a collective educational experience. Women gained new skills in budgeting, nutrition, long-term planning. Wartime scarcity brought with it a unique challenge: how to nourish families when many familiar ingredients disappeared from shelves. Women, already burdened with the pressures of rationing and household responsibilities, now faced the additional task of reinventing cooking itself. Recipes that had been handed down for generations suddenly became impossible to prepare. Beloved ingredients, sugar, butter, eggs, meat, milk, were either heavily rationed or unavailable for entire stretches of time. Women found themselves standing in kitchens that felt oddly foreign, surrounded by the same pots and pans, but confronted with new limitations that demanded creativity, patience, and a willingness to experiment. It was no longer enough to simply follow familiar recipes. Cooking became a form of innovation, a daily test of ingenuity under pressure. The quest for substitutes reshaped not only the meals families ate, but also the culture, identity, and psychology of home cooking during wartime. At the heart of this transformation was the simple necessity of making do. Governments published pamphlets filled with substitute suggestions, offering replacements for rationed ingredients. But these substitutions were often far from ideal. Powdered milk instead of fresh milk, vegetable fats instead of butter, carrots or turnips to sweeten cakes when sugar was unavailable. Women quickly learned that substitutes behaved differently in cooking. Vegetable fats melted faster. Powdered milk sometimes clumped. Flour alternatives produced unpredictable textures. Cakes made with mashed potatoes or grated carrots needed different baking times. Bread baked with unfamiliar grains rose unevenly or became dense. Every meal was an experiment, and every experiment carried emotional weight. Women wanted to preserve a sense of normalcy at the dinner table, even when their ingredients defied tradition. The kitchen became a laboratory where trial and error ruled. Women wrote notes in the margins of cookbooks, recording which substitutions worked and which were failures. Families often gathered around the table uncertain of what the next meal might taste like. There were triumphs, creative dishes that surprised everyone with their flavor, and there were failures that became family jokes or disappointing memories. Wartime diaries reveal countless stories of cakes that refused to rise, soups that tasted thin, or breads that turned out tough. Yet they also reveal the pride women felt when a risky substitution worked. The sense of accomplishment was profound. Cooking successfully under such restrictions was not just a matter of feeding the family, it was a victory over the constraints of war. One of the most iconic wartime substitute techniques was the use of vegetables to replace sweeteners. Sugar was one of the earliest and strictest ration items, forcing women to rethink baking entirely. Carrots, with their natural sweetness, became a popular alternative. Grated into batters, carrot added moisture and mild sweetness to cakes and puddings. Some women used beetroot for its intense sweetness, though its strong flavor required careful balancing. Dried fruit, raisins, prunes, or dates was soaked, mashed, or chopped to mimic sugar. Molasses and syrups, when available, were used sparingly to add depth to baked goods. Over time, these creative solutions became so normalized that carrot cake itself gained cultural traction long after the war ended. Butter and fats posed another significant challenge. Without these familiar ingredients, many traditional dishes seemed impossible to prepare. Women learned to render fat from meat scraps, collect drippings, or create homemade spreads using margarine mixed with herbs or mashed vegetables. Government pamphlets encouraged stretching fats by blending them with milk or mixing small batches into larger batches of dough. Some women used oil, though its availability varied. Vegetable-based fats became standard, but were often disliked for their sharp taste or unusual texture. Still, women adapted, learning how to soften these substitutes with warm water or combine them with spices to mask unpleasant flavors. Their resourcefulness reflected a broader wartime theme, the relentless ability to transform limited resources into something functional. Eggs, another heavily rationed item, inspired some of the most creative wartime solutions. Fresh eggs were scarce, and powdered eggs became the norm. But powdered eggs required careful handling to avoid grainy textures. Women soaked them, whipped them vigorously, and experimented with different ratios of water. They were used in cakes, scrambles, and batters, though the taste often disappointed. Some families joked that powdered eggs tasted more powder than egg, but they remained essential. In the absence of any eggs, banana pulp, vinegar mixed with baking soda, or mashed potatoes sometimes replaced them in baking. These substitutions created strange but memorable results. Cakes made with vinegar and soda foamed dramatically, a source of fascination for children watching from the kitchen table. Though these cakes sometimes had unusual textures, they were symbols of triumph over limitation. Meat posed an even more complex challenge. Rationing meant that families rarely had access to fresh cuts of beef, pork, or poultry. Women learned to stretch meat by mixing it with oats, breadcrumbs, grated vegetables, or flour-based fillers. Meatloaf became a staple, often containing more fillers than meat. Stews grew thinner but were bulked up with root vegetables, barley, or lentils. Some women learned to cook with organ meats, which were cheaper and more available. Despite their unfamiliarity, hearts, kidneys, and livers became common ingredients in households that had never served them before. Women used spices, onions, and slow cooking techniques to soften strong flavors and textures. Cooking with organ meats was not always popular, but it became a symbol of wartime frugality and adaptation. The scarcity of milk also forced women to rethink daily meals. Powdered milk became a fixture in many households, but its flavor was often disliked. Women mixed it with a small portion of fresh milk when available, or flavored it with cocoa or vanilla to make it more palatable. Some diluted milk with water to make it further, a practice that required careful nutritional planning. Custards, puddings, and sauces made with powdered milk took practice to perfect, as the texture was prone to lumping. But over time, women learned techniques, pre-dissolving the powder, whisking vigorously, and heating slowly that helped smooth the results. The persistence required to master powdered milk became a small but meaningful example of the way wartime cooking demanded both patience and skill. Bread, a staple of daily meals, underwent its own transformation. White bread disappeared, replaced by national loaves or whole grain alternatives. These breads were dense, darker, and slower to stale, but their coarse texture took some getting used to. Women learned to use stale bread creatively, turning it into puddings, crumbs, thickeners, and stuffings. Nothing could be wasted. Bread became both a precious resource and a versatile ingredient. Some women baked their own loaves, using government-issued recipes that relied on less desirable flours. These homemade loaves varied dramatically in texture and flavor. Families sometimes teased mothers about heavy or uneven loaves, but such teasing was often affectionate. The reality was that baking during wartime required navigating unpredictable ingredients and balancing limited resources. Even beverages were not spared the effects of wartime shortages. Tea, heavily rationed, became a luxury. Women reused tea leaves, steeping them several times, or mixed them with herbs to stretch their supply. Some experimented with roasted barley or dandelion roots as coffee substitutes. Cocoa, when available, was reserved for children or special occasions. Adults often drank weak, watery substitutes that bore little resemblance to pre-war beverages. Yet families adapted. Tea rituals continued even when the tea itself tasted faint or diluted. These rituals offered comfort, continuity, and a sense of connection to normal life. The emotional significance of a small warm cup, even one made with substitute ingredients, could not be overstated. Desserts, too, required reinvention. Cakes made with carrots, mashed potatoes, or dried fruit became popular. Puddings were thickened with flour instead of eggs. Cookies relied on syrup or fruit puree instead of sugar. Women learned to extract sweetness from unconventional ingredients and to appreciate milder flavors. Families lowered their expectations but raised their appreciation for the effort behind each dessert. Children born during wartime sometimes grew up believing that carrot-based sweets were normal. The palate of an entire generation subtly shifted in response to these inventive solutions. Communities played a significant role in the spread of substitute-based cooking techniques. Women exchanged recipes at markets, schools, workplaces, and communal events. Handwritten cookbooks circulated, filled with notes, corrections, and personal touches. These shared recipes became valuable tools of survival. They also formed a cultural bond among women, an acknowledgement that everyone was struggling, learning, and adapting. Cooking became a collective experience, not only within families, but across neighborhoods and communities. The sharing of successful substitutes became a form of generosity, strengthening social ties and fostering cooperation. Children experienced the effects of substitute-based cooking in unique ways. Some were picky eaters who struggled to accept unfamiliar flavors or textures. Wartime rationing altered the daily routines of every household, but nowhere were the pressures more intensely felt than in the care of those considered most vulnerable: children, whose nutritional needs determined their growth, the elderly, whose bodies struggled to adapt to scarcity, and laborers, whose long hours demanded sustained physical strength. Women stood at the center of this delicate balancing act. Their decisions shaped not only the survival of their families, but also the endurance of entire communities whose well-being depended on the women who fed, monitored, and protected them through a period defined by shortages, anxiety, and unending change. Families that had once relied on familiar meal structures suddenly faced an unpredictable world of substitutes, reduced portions, and meals that bore little resemblance to pre-war habits. For mothers and caregivers, the stakes were highest when feeding children. Children's nutritional deficits could cause permanent developmental consequences, so women had to become vigilant scholars of nutrition, learning how to maximize vitamins and calories from ingredients that were often unfamiliar. Government ministries, aware of the critical role children played in the nation's morale and future, circulated pamphlets instructing women to use every scrap of food, to replace scarce items with nutrient-dense alternatives, and to create meals that disguised shortages without alarming young minds already troubled by air raid sirens and sudden evacuations. School canteens became essential to this survival network. Teachers and female volunteers transformed classrooms into communal dining spaces where children received structured meals designed to ensure at least one nutritionally complete dish each day. These meals often consisted of vegetable stews, fortified bread, milk substitutes, or ration-approved puddings enriched with powdered vitamins. Women worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating deliveries, adapting menus, and mitigating the disappointment of children who longed for pre-war treats. Though the meals were simple, they became symbols of stability in a world that repeatedly reminded families of their vulnerability. At home, creative solutions became the norm. Mothers soaked beans overnight to stretch them further, mashed vegetables into inventive shapes to encourage children to eat them, and turned gardens into critical spaces of nourishment. Victory gardens, managed almost entirely by women, produced carrots, greens, root vegetables, and herbs that provided essential micronutrients. Every harvest, no matter how small, contributed to easing shortages, and women taught their children the importance of tending soil as a form of wartime responsibility. In many households, gardening became a ritual of hope, grounding families in predictable routines during a time when nothing else seemed stable. For the elderly, wartime rationing posed different challenges. Older adults often had difficulty digesting certain substitutes or adjusting to new textures and flavors. Women caring for aging parents or grandparents had to modify recipes thoughtfully, ensuring meals were soft, digestible, and comforting despite the restrictions. Many elderly citizens had lived through previous conflicts or economic depressions, and some possessed deep-seated habits about food scarcity, leading them to skip meals or surrender their rations to younger family members. This self-sacrifice, though born from love, put them at a greater risk of malnutrition. Women therefore had to navigate not only the nutritional needs of the elderly, but also the emotional dynamics that drove them to prioritize others over themselves. Community centers became critical meeting points where women organized shared meals for older residents. These gatherings created social lifelines that helped combat isolation, an often overlooked consequence of wartime living. Women volunteers served porridge, vegetable broth, stewed fruit, and small servings of fortified bread, while offering companionship that softened the loneliness many elderly individuals felt when families were separated by evacuation or military service. The sense of belonging fostered at these community meals often held just as much therapeutic value as the food itself. Workers, especially those laboring in factories, mines, construction sites, and transport sectors, presented a third group whose nutritional needs demanded careful planning. As wartime industries expanded, demanding long shifts and intense physical effort, women were expected to provide sustaining meals despite ongoing shortages. Many women themselves worked long hours, yet still carried the responsibility of preparing high-calorie meals for husbands, brothers, or sons working in physically taxing occupations. This dual burden created emotional and physical exhaustion, but also demonstrated the resilience that defined women's wartime experiences. Women packed lunch tins filled with hearty items such as bread fortified with vegetable fats, potato cakes seasoned with herbs from home gardens, leftover stews thickened with barley, and homemade energy bars consisting of oats, syrup, and dried fruit if available. Though simple, these meals offered essential fuel that kept industrial and agricultural production running. In many cases, women rose hours before dawn to prepare food, then rushed to their own jobs, returning home only to repeat the cycle the next day. Their silent labor formed an invisible backbone of national survival. Communal feeding initiatives emerged as a response to worker needs. Factory canteens, staffed largely by women, served thousands of meals daily. Soups made from surplus vegetables, porridges enriched with powdered milk, or casseroles designed to stretch limited meat supplies as far as possible. Women employed in these kitchens developed techniques for maximizing flavors, using herbs, pickling liquids, and vegetable scraps to create meals that felt hearty even when ingredients were sparse. These canteens became crucial in maintaining worker morale, reminding laborers that their effort was recognized and supported. Despite these systems, women remained the primary problem solvers when rations ran thin. They turned stale bread into puddings, combined leftover vegetables into soups, and stretched meat by blending it with oats or lentils. Children learned early that nothing could be wasted, not a peel, not a crumb, not a spoonful of fat saved in jars by the stove. Women cultivated a meticulous awareness of ingredients, tracking every ounce of sugar, every sliver of butter, and every ration coupon as if each one were a lifeline. Their ability to manage scarcity with patience became the difference between hunger and sustenance for those they cared for. Psychologically, the pressure of feeding vulnerable family members weighed heavily. Women hid their own hunger so children could eat more. They quietly served smaller portions to themselves so elderly parents or fatigued husbands could recover. Many experienced guilt, fearing that meals were inadequate or that shortages would harm their children's future. But they rarely voiced these worries. Instead, they channeled their anxiety into planning, organizing, and adapting, creating new rituals around food that maintained a sense of normalcy. The act of feeding vulnerable individuals became not only a physical responsibility, but a profound emotional commitment. Every meal represented love, protection, and defiance against the broader chaos of war. Food was a reminder that families still existed, traditions endured, and care persisted even when the world seemed intent on taking those comforts away. For children, an evening meal offered reassurance that their caregivers were still in control. For the elderly, warm soup symbolized dignity and belonging. For workers, a packed lunch affirmed that someone appreciated their sacrifices. By the end of the war, the strategies women developed for feeding the vulnerable had reshaped domestic life. The gardens they tended, the recipes they invented, the systems they built, and the resilience they displayed contributed significantly to their community's survival. These contributions often went unrecorded or unacknowledged, yet they formed a foundational element of wartime endurance. Women had fed not just their families, but the morale of entire nations, ensuring that the vulnerable remained protected despite the hardships that defined the era. The story of wartime rationing is often told through statistics, policies, and logistics, but beneath these visible layers lies an emotional landscape shaped by the quiet heroism of women who carried the psychological burdens of scarcity. While bombs fell outside and nations mobilized along battle lines, an invisible battle unfolded within the walls of millions of homes. Women were expected to remain calm, organized, resourceful, and emotionally steady, even as the world around them frayed under the weight of conflict. Their strength became a lifeline for families who depended on their ability to hold chaos at bay through something as deceptively simple as a daily meal. Rationing was not merely an economic policy, it was an emotional test. Women navigated an environment where ingredients were unpredictable, supplies scarce, and every decision carried consequences for the health and morale of the people they loved. This pressure produced forms of stress that rarely appeared in official documentation, yet defined the lived reality of wartime domestic life. One of the most profound psychological impacts came from the fear of inadequacy. Many women worried constantly about whether the food they prepared was sufficient to sustain their families. Newspapers and radio broadcasts emphasized the importance of proper nutrition for national strength, placing enormous responsibility on women to uphold these standards despite limited resources. Mothers felt guilt when meals lacked variety, when children complained of hunger, or when elderly parents seemed weakened by shortages. Even though the lack of supplies was beyond their control, many internalized these struggles as personal failures. Behind closed doors, women often skipped meals or reduced their own portions to ensure that children and laboring family members received enough to eat. This self-sacrifice, though rarely acknowledged publicly, became one of the defining features of wartime domestic resilience. Many women lived in a constant state of fatigue and hunger, yet continued to maintain steady routines, smiling for the sake of their families, even when they themselves were worn thin. Another psychological challenge lay in the monotony imposed by rationing. Before the war, food often carried emotional meaning. Celebrations marked with sweet treats, family gatherings centered around generous meals, and cultural traditions expressed through specific dishes. The war stripped many of these rituals away. Weeks could pass without sugar, meat, or fresh fruits. Birthdays were celebrated with makeshift cakes or none at all. Holiday meals became symbolic rather than abundant. Women bore the emotional responsibility of preserving joy despite these limitations. They invented substitutes for holiday dishes, decorated simple meals with whatever they had, and used creativity to disguise shortages so that children would still feel excitement on special days. These acts required constant emotional labor, the ability to transform disappointment into resilience and scarcity into meaning. The strain grew heavier for women whose husbands, sons, or brothers were serving on the front lines. The kitchen table became a place where absence was felt deeply, and every meal underscored the uncertainty of survival. Women carried silent fear while continuing their daily routines, knowing that maintaining normalcy for their families was perhaps the only thing they could control. Letters from soldiers often asked women not to worry, but the rationed meals they prepared served as daily reminders of the war's reach. Many women used food as a way to channel their anxiety into something productive. Kneading dough, tending gardens, preserving vegetables, and preparing meals became therapeutic rituals, ways to maintain stability when the world offered few assurances. The act of feeding others became a declaration of hope, a refusal to allow fear to consume the family unit. Community support played a significant role in easing the emotional burden. Women formed networks where they shared recipes, exchanged ingredients, swapped ration coupons when regulations allowed, and offered comfort during moments of frustration. These networks helped women feel less isolated, reaffirming that their struggles were shared across neighborhoods and cities. Community cookery demonstrations, often led by women, provided not only practical knowledge, but also emotional reassurance that solutions existed even in times of severe shortage. Yet even within these supportive circles, women tended to minimize their struggles. Cultural expectations encouraged them to project strength, patience, and adaptability, often leaving their emotional needs unspoken. Many diaries from the era reveal private confessions of worry, exhaustion, and a longing for normal life, feelings that rarely surfaced in public conversations. Another significant emotional strain came from the constant need to adapt. Rationing rules changed frequently, creating uncertainty and forcing women to relearn shopping and cooking practices repeatedly. A new shortage might eliminate a familiar ingredient overnight, turning carefully crafted weekly meal plans into puzzles that needed immediate solutions. This unpredictability created a background hum of stress that rarely subsided. Even visiting shops became emotionally taxing. Long queues tested patience. Arguments sometimes broke out when supplies ran out. Women navigated these tensions while attempting to maintain dignity and calm, often with children by their side. Shopkeepers were also under strain, and interactions could become strained as supplies worsened. Women absorbed this tension, returning home to create meals while suppressing frustration so as not to alarm their families. Despite the difficulties, The emotional strength women demonstrated became a stabilizing force within wartime communities. Their ability to ration ingredients into comforting meals created psychological safety for those around them. Children learned resilience, not just from air raid drills or school lessons, but from watching caregivers transform scarcity into nourishment. Elderly family members felt protected by the steady, patient presence of daughters and granddaughters who adapted meals to suit their needs. Workers found reassurance in the lunches packed for them each morning, small gestures that conveyed love and solidarity. This quiet heroism was not dramatic or celebrated, yet it left a profound legacy. It reshaped gender expectations, revealing the immense emotional labor women were capable of handling under extreme pressure. It also influenced post-war society, as the emotional endurance developed during rationing years informed new approaches to domestic life, community organization, and family relationships. Perhaps the most powerful element of this heroism was its invisibility. Women did not perform these acts in search of recognition. They acted out of duty, compassion, and an unwavering belief that survival depended not only on food, but on the emotional strength that surrounded it. Their courage was woven into daily routines, spoken through gestures rather than words, and embodied by the meals they placed on the table, no matter how limited their supplies.